In January 1959, 9 people walked into the Ural Mountains and did not come back. This is the simplest way to say it. Everything that follows, the contradictions, the evidence, the theories, the investigations that span 6 decades and 2 political systems, and the full arc from Soviet certainty to post-Soviet confusion, begins here. 9 people. The Urals. January. Gone. They were not amateurs. That is the first thing you need to understand about the Dyatlov group, and it is the thing that makes their death so difficult to accept on simple terms. They were experienced, fit, careful, and trained. They had done this before, many times, in conditions as demanding as the ones they were heading into. Igor Dyatlov, who led the group and whose name the past now carries, had completed dozens of mountaineering and ski touring expeditions in the years before this one. He was 23 years old and already known as one of the best route finders and most capable expedition leaders in the hiking club of the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, a club that, in 1959, was home to some of the most accomplished young mountaineers in the Soviet Union. He did not merely participate in expeditions. He thought about them as engineering problems, optimizing equipment, designing solutions to anticipated difficulties, thinking through the logic of a route the way an engineer thinks through the logic of a structure. He modified his own ski bindings to reduce weight without sacrificing function. He designed a lightweight tent configuration that other members of the club adopted. He kept meticulous notes on every expedition and used them to plan the next one. When he chose a route, he had thought about it. When he chose a campsite, he had reasons. When he made decisions in the field, those decisions were the product of years of accumulated experience and careful preparation. This is not the profile of someone who makes avoidable mistakes in the field. This is the profile of someone who does not make avoidable mistakes. The other 8 were similarly accomplished. Zinaida Kolmogorova had completed several Category 2 expeditions, the second highest difficulty classification in the Soviet mountaineering system. She was 22 years old and had been hiking and skiing in the Urals for 5 years. She was also, by the accounts of everyone who knew her, one of the most cheerful and socially alive people in the hiking club, the person at the center of every photograph, the person whose energy made the long cold days feel shorter, whose laughter was remembered by her companions long after the specific conversations were forgotten. Her diary entries from the expedition, recovered later and pored over by investigators and researchers for decades, have the quality of someone fully present in their own life, noticing the quality of the snow, complaining gently about the weight of her pack, making observations about the landscape that are precise and affectionate at once. Lyudmila Dubinina was 20, the youngest woman in the group. She was known for her extraordinary physical endurance and for what her companions described as a stubborn refusal to acknowledge difficulty. The conditions that wore others down sharpened her. She had completed more difficult expeditions than her age would suggest and had earned the respect of hikers considerably senior to her, not through charm or social ease, which were not her primary qualities, but through performance, through being the person you could count on when the weather turned or the route went wrong. Rustam Slobodin was 23, an engineer by training who brought that engineer's precision to everything he did on an expedition. He kept records, not just the diary entries that everyone contributed, but technical notes. Slope gradients, snow densities, equipment weights, times. He was the person in the group most likely to be able to reconstruct exactly what had happened on a given day from the physical evidence alone. Those notes, later recovered from the tent, were invaluable to the investigators who tried to piece together the group's final days. Yuri Krivonyshenko was 23 and worked at the Mayak nuclear facility in Chelyabinsk Oblast, a detail that would become significant later, and that we will return to more than once before this night is over. He was the musician of the group. He had brought a small mandolin on the expedition, which was recovered with the other belongings. In the photographs taken during the early days of the hike, photographs that were later developed and distributed to the families and to investigators, he is often the one with the instrument in his hands, playing in the evenings in the warmth of the tent while the others ate or wrote in their journals or argued gently about the next day's route. Yuri Doroshenko was 21. He was, by several accounts, romantically involved with Zina Kolmogorova, or had been recently. The precise nature of their relationship in January 1959 is unclear and was never fully resolved, partly because everyone who might have known was dead before anyone thought to ask, and partly because the Soviet investigation was not concerned with such questions. What is clear is that they were in each other's company often, that they appear together in several of the expedition photographs with the easy proximity of people who are either together or were recently together, and that both of them are gone now, and the question of what they were to each other belongs to them. Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles was 24, the oldest of the core student group. His name is French in origin. He was the grandson of a French political prisoner who had been sent to Siberia in the 19th century and had remained in Russia when his sentence ended, building a life in a country that had imprisoned him. The family had been in Russia for 3 generations by the time Nikolai was born, but the name remained, carrying with it the complicated history of someone who belongs to a place without quite being of it. More practically, Nikolai was the son of a man who had been arrested and executed during the Stalinist purges of the 1930s, a fact that would have cast a long shadow over his life in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from outside that system. To be the child of an enemy of the people in Soviet society required careful navigation, a particular kind of social awareness, a learned habit of presenting oneself in ways that deflected scrutiny. His companions noted a seriousness about him that the others did not have, a quality of watchfulness. Semyon Zolotaryov was 38, older than the others by more than a decade, older than most of their parents, a different generation entirely. He was not a student at the Polytechnic Institute but had joined the group through the university hiking club as an experienced external member. He was a veteran of the Second World War, an infantryman who had fought at some of the most brutal engagements of the Eastern Front, Stalingrad, Kursk, the sieges and counter-sieges of a war that killed approximately 1 in 10 Soviet citizens. He had come out of that war alive, which required a combination of luck and skill and the particular quality of endurance that combat either produces or destroys. He had been an expedition leader himself, with his own body of experience in difficult terrain and extreme cold. His presence in a group of students, his willingness to join, rather than lead, a group 2 decades his junior, was unusual enough that it attracted subsequent attention from investigators and researchers. We will return to Semyon Zolotaryov. There are things about him that do not fit easily into the simple picture of 9 friends on a winter hike, and those things matter. And then there was Yuri Yudin, who does not appear in the death toll. Yuri Yudin was the 10th member of the group who left Sverdlovsk with the others on January 23, 1959. He was 21 years old, a geology student, a hiker of several years' experience with a genuine love of the northern Urals landscape. He reached the first waypoint in good health. And then his joints began to hurt. The pain was the onset of what was later diagnosed as rheumatism, a condition that would accompany him for the rest of his life, that would mark him as much as anything else, that would be inseparable from the story he carried. On the morning of January 28th, after the group had been traveling for 5 days and had reached the settlement of Vizhay, the last inhabited place before the wilderness, the last cluster of buildings and human warmth between them and the deep Urals, Yuri Yudin made the decision to turn back. He was transported by a passing vehicle to the nearest town. He watched his 9 friends continue into the mountains without him. He was 21 years old, and he spent the next 54 years as the only person who had walked with the Dyatlov group and come back. He was the last person to see all 9 of them alive. He stood at the edge of the wilderness and watched them go in, and he went back, and they did not. He carried that knowledge for 54 years, through the decades when the files were classified and no one would discuss what had happened, through the opening of the archives and the flood of speculation that followed, through the media attention that arrived in the 1990s and the documentaries of the 2000s and the renewed official investigation of the 2010s. In interviews given late in his life, when he was in his 70s and the world had finally decided to pay sustained attention to what had happened to his friends, he said that not a day passed without his thinking of them. He had gone over the events of those 5 days, the meals, the conversations, the photographs, the small decisions and small moments, thousands of times. He had read every investigation document available to him. He had visited the pass. He had spoken with researchers, journalists, documentarians, forensic specialists. He had done everything a person could reasonably do to understand what had happened. He never found a satisfying answer. He died in April 2013 at the age of 75, and the question went with him, as unanswered as it had been on the morning he turned back at Vyzhy and watched his friends disappear into the mountains. The northern Urals in winter is a landscape of extreme simplicity. There is snow, and there is sky, and there are the dark shapes of the spruce and cedar forests in the lower valleys, and above the tree line there is nothing but white and grey and wind. The mountains here are not the dramatic peaks of the Alps or the Caucasus. They are old, eroded, rounded at the top, worn down by time into something that looks almost gentle until you are inside them in February and the wind comes from the north and the temperature drops to -30 and the gentle-looking ridges offer no shelter at all. The Ural mountain range runs roughly north to south for about 2,000 kilometers, forming the traditional boundary between Europe and Asia. It is, geologically, one of the oldest mountain ranges on Earth. Its peaks were once as dramatic as the Alps, but 1 billion years of erosion have reduced them to their current rounded profiles. The northern end of the range, where the Dyatlov group was traveling, is sparsely inhabited, even now. In 1959 it was more so. The Soviet state had built a network of labor camps, the Gulag system, throughout the northern Urals and beyond, and the landscape bore the marks of that history in the form of remote settlements built around extraction industries, closed roads that served facilities the state did not acknowledge, and a population that had learned, over generations, to ask few questions about what went on in the deep forest. The Monsey people are the indigenous inhabitants of the northern Urals, a small nation of perhaps a few thousand, whose relationship with the land they have occupied for at least 4,000 years has been shaped, in the last few centuries, by Russian colonization, Soviet collectivization, and all the disruption that follows from having a larger culture decide that your territory is more valuable than your presence. The Monsey have survived all of this, and they have maintained, alongside their adapted modern life, a relationship with the landscape that is older and more specific than anything the Soviet surveyors or the Russian administrators or the hiking club from Sverdlovsk brought with them. The mountain the Dyatlov group was heading for, Otorten, has a name that translates from Monsey as "do not go there." The mountain where they died, Kholat Syakhl, translates as "dead mountain." These names were not given carelessly, and they were not given recently. They reflect an accumulated knowledge of this landscape that precedes any written record, that was encoded in place names precisely because place names are among the most durable forms of cultural memory. The Monsey had reasons for the names they chose, and those reasons were not decorative. The expedition had been planned with the precision that Igor Dyatlov brought to everything. The route was logged with the hiking club, with waypoints and estimated timings. Checkpoints had been established at which the group was expected to telegraph their progress. A return telegram was expected by February 12th, at which point the group would be back in Sverdlovsk after a successful expedition to Otorten and back. If the telegram did not arrive by February 12th, a search was to be organized. The telegram did not arrive. The search was organized on February 20th, 1959, 8 days after the group was expected back. The delay was partly bureaucratic and partly practical. Organizing a search in the northern Urals in February, in territory accessible only on foot or by ski, was not a matter of simply dispatching a team. The hiking club raised the alarm. The university authorities were informed. The regional authorities were informed. Military search parties were coordinated. Aircraft were made available. All of this took time, and in the meantime, the 9 were in the mountains, and whatever had happened to them had already happened. The first search team was composed largely of student volunteers from the same hiking club, people who knew the terrain, knew the members of the Dyatlov group personally, and had the skills to operate in winter mountain conditions. They were accompanied by military search parties and, eventually, by aircraft that searched from above while the ground teams moved through the forests and across the slopes below. On February 26, 6 days after the search began, the first searchers reached the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl. They found the tent. The tent had been pitched on the slope in the way that experienced winter mountaineers pitch tents on slopes, dug partially into the snow to provide some insulation from below, anchored with ski poles against the wind, positioned with the entrance oriented away from the prevailing weather. The technique was correct. The location was not ideal. A more sheltered campsite was available lower down the slope, in the relative protection of the tree line, but the choice to camp higher was consistent with the group's plan to make an early start the following morning on the last significant climb before Otorten. It was a reasonable choice. An experienced choice. The tent had been cut open from the inside. Not collapsed by wind. Not buried by snow and then dug out in panic. Not torn by any external force. Cut, deliberately, with a knife, in 2 places, from the inside, with the cuts oriented to push outward and create openings large enough for a person to climb through. The cuts were not clean. They were the cuts of someone working quickly, someone who needed to be out of the tent immediately and was not concerned with preserving the fabric. The inside of the tent showed signs of the occupants having been asleep, or at least lying down, when whatever happened happened, sleeping bags unrolled, positions suggesting rest rather than alertness. The contents of the tent were essentially undisturbed. The food and cooking equipment were present and organized. The cameras were present, including cameras that had been used during the expedition and whose film, later developed, provided the photographs of the group's first days that are now among the most examined images in the history of unsolved mysteries. The diaries were present. Rustam Slobodin's technical notes were present. And the warm outer clothing, the heavy coats, the felt boots, the thick woolen trousers and extra layers that an experienced mountaineer would consider non-negotiable equipment in -15-degree temperatures with wind, was present. All of it. Untouched. Whatever drove 9 experienced, careful, well-equipped mountaineers out of their tent in the middle of a February night in the northern Urals, it drove them out fast enough that they left their boots behind. Let that sit for a moment. These were people who understood cold. They had spent weeks at a time in winter wilderness. They knew what -15 degrees without proper clothing meant. They knew it in the way that only people who have lived at those temperatures can know it, with the embodied knowledge of cold that gets into the bones and stays there. They knew it with the knowledge of people who had treated frostbite, who had seen what exposure did, who had made decisions about warmth and survival in the field many times. And whatever happened, they decided, collectively, in the dark, in -15, that facing that cold in their underclothes was preferable to remaining in the tent. The tracks. In the snow around and below the tent, the searchers found the tracks of 9 people leading down the slope in the direction of the tree line, approximately 1.5 kilometers away. The tracks were studied carefully by the searchers and later by forensic experts brought in to reconstruct the group's final movements. They told a story that was, in certain ways, more disturbing than chaos would have been. The tracks were not scattered randomly across the slope. They followed a general direction, as if the group was moving with a destination in mind rather than fleeing without direction. Several of the tracks showed the impression of bare feet. Several showed the impression of a single boot, suggesting that some members of the group had managed to put on one boot but not both before leaving the tent. One track showed the print of feet wrapped in something, cloth, perhaps, or a torn piece of clothing fashioned into a makeshift covering. Someone in the group had had enough presence of mind, in those first moments, to improvise some protection for their feet before beginning to move. The tracks led to the tree line and then became harder to follow, as the snow beneath the trees had been disturbed by wind and by the subsequent movements of the search parties. But the general direction was clear. The group had moved, together, toward the cedar trees at the edge of the forest. The first bodies. 5 of the 9 were found within the first weeks of the search. The remaining 4 were buried under several meters of snow in a ravine below the tree line and were not found until May, when the spring melt exposed them. Igor Dyatlov was found on the slope between the tent and the tree line, face up, frozen in a position that suggested he had been trying to return to the tent when he died. One arm was raised, the fingers slightly curved, a gesture that the searchers found difficult to look at and that has been described in many subsequent accounts as having the quality of someone reaching for something just out of reach. He died of hypothermia. Zina Kolmogorova was found nearby, also on the slope, also in a position that suggested she had been moving uphill, back toward the tent, back toward the clothing and boots and warmth that were up there, just out of reach. She had used her final energy trying to get back to the shelter she had left. She died of hypothermia. She was 22 years old. Rustam Slobodin was found between them, also on the slope. He had a small fracture in his skull, a crack approximately 6 centimeters long, in the right temporal bone. The forensic examination concluded that this fracture had not caused, or significantly contributed to, his death. He had continued to move after sustaining the injury, and the crack, while real, was not in itself life-threatening. He died of hypothermia. Yuri Krivonyshenko and Yuri Doroshenko were found at the tree line, near a large cedar tree. There was evidence of a fire at the base of the cedar, a small fire, built hastily with the dry lower branches of the tree, the kind of fire that provides warmth for minutes rather than hours. Both men were in their underclothes. Both had burns on their hands and feet, consistent with reaching into or standing too close to a fire whose warmth they needed desperately, whose diminishing heat they were trying to capture at the cost of injury. Branches of the cedar had been broken off up to a height of approximately 5 meters, suggesting that one or both of them had climbed the tree. Whether they climbed to look for something, to see the tent, to signal, to understand where they were, or to escape something on the ground is not known and cannot be determined from the physical evidence. Between the cedar fire and the bodies of Dyatlov and Kolmogorova on the slope, there were traces of cloth, strips of fabric cut or torn from clothing, the kind of improvised insulation that people use when the proper equipment is not available. researchers have theorized that Krivonischenko and Doroshenko, recognizing that they were dying, stripped pieces of their remaining clothing and left them for the others, for Dyatlov and Kolmogorova and Slobodin, who were trying to make it back to the tent, who needed anything that could give them a few more minutes against the cold. Whether that is what happened, we cannot say. What we can say is that people were making decisions in the cold and the dark that suggest not blind panic but something more deliberate, not chaos but a kind of terrible, clear-eyed recognition of what the situation required and what resources remained. The group had separated, for reasons we do not know, and they were trying, in their separate positions, to survive. Some of them were trying to help the others survive. The ravine victims. The 4 bodies found in May told a different and more disturbing story, one that the spring-thaw revealed and that has been at the center of the investigation and the controversy ever since. Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles had a severe fracture of the temporal bone of his skull, the kind of fracture, the chief pathologist Boris Vozrozdeny noted in his report, that is produced by a sudden, significant compressive force. Not a fall onto ice, which would have left different marks. Not a blow from a fist or a conventional weapon. The kind of force that a car accident might produce, or a sudden pressure applied over a wide area simultaneously. The skin of his head was intact. There was no external wound, no bruising, no abrasion corresponding to the fracture. Whatever had crushed his skull from the outside had done so without breaking the skin. Ludmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov both had multiple broken ribs and significant damage to internal organs. The rib fractures in both cases were bilateral, both sides of the chest, simultaneously, and the pattern of the fractures was consistent, again, with a force applied from outside rather than from a fall. Not a collision with a hard surface in the way a fall produces fractures. Something that hit them, or hit the space they were in, with a force applied over a broad area with considerable velocity. And Ludmila Dubinina was missing her tongue. The initial investigation attributed this to natural decomposition and animal scavenging. The bodies had been under snow and in a stream bed for 3 months before discovery, and soft tissue decomposition in those conditions can be rapid and selective. This is a reasonable general point. Decomposition happens, scavenging happens, soft tissue in wet environments degrades faster than surrounding tissue. Many subsequent researchers have disputed the attribution in this specific case, noting that the pattern of missing tissue in Dubinina's case does not match the typical patterns of rodent or insect scavenging in those conditions, and that certain surrounding tissues that would be expected to decompose more quickly or to be taken first by scavengers were relatively preserved. Her eyes were also missing. One of the other ravine victims was missing his eyes as well. The chief pathologist, Boris Vozrozdeny, described the injuries in his report with professional precision and, at the end, with a phrase that has been quoted in virtually every account of the Dyatlov incident since. He wrote that the injuries to the ravine victims required a force that was, in his judgment, not consistent with any known natural cause applicable to that location and situation. He used, in his report, the phrase that has been at the center of 65 years of speculation. An unknown compelling force. The Soviet investigation was led by Lev Ivanov, a senior investigator from the Sverdlovsk Regional Prosecutor's Office. He was competent and experienced, and he worked the case for several months, interviewing dozens of witnesses, reviewing the physical and forensic evidence, tracking the group's route as far as it could be reconstructed. He reached the conclusion that the deaths had been caused by circumstances he could not, on the available evidence, explain. In May 1959, the investigation was officially closed. The cause of death for all 9 was listed as hypothermia, with the internal injuries of the ravine victims attributed to the unknown compelling force. The case files were classified and transferred to a restricted archive. The families of the 9 were given death certificates but not explanations. They were told that their children had died in the mountains, that the cause was determined to be natural, and that no further investigation was warranted. For 30 years, the full records of what was found on Kholat Syakhl were accessible only to people with the appropriate security clearance. There are details from the investigation that were not included in the original official report but emerged later, through leaked documents, through the testimony of investigators who survived long enough to speak in the more open atmosphere of the post-Soviet period, and through the partial archive release that accompanied the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The radioactive contamination. When the clothing of several of the victims was subjected to radiation testing, a standard procedure in the context of a Soviet investigation that involved a worker from Mayak, the Soviet Union's primary nuclear weapons production facility, elevated levels of radioactive contamination were found. The levels were described in the testing report as medium, above background radiation levels, above the levels that would be expected from normal environmental exposure in the region, but not at a level associated with acute radiation sickness. The contamination was concentrated on specific items of clothing, particularly those belonging to Krivonyshenko, who worked at Mayak, but also on items belonging to other members of the group. No explanation was offered in the investigation for how radioactive contamination had reached the clothing of the Dyatlov group in the middle of the northern Urals, approximately 300 kilometers from the nearest nuclear facility. The finding was recorded, placed in the file, and in the official closure of the investigation, not returned to. It was classified along with everything else. The coloration of the skin. Multiple members of the search team, experienced mountaineers themselves, people who had seen bodies in various states of exposure, reported that the bodies had an unusual coloration. Not the pallor typical of hypothermia deaths, not the discoloration typical of the decomposition stage the bodies had reached, but a tan or orange tinge that was inconsistent with what they expected and that several of them mentioned independently, without coordination. The official investigation attributed this to the effects of weather exposure and decomposition. Some subsequent researchers have associated it with certain types of radiation exposure, which is known to affect skin pigmentation in ways that persist after death. Others have suggested chemical contamination. The investigation made no determination. The luminous spheres. On the night of February 1st, 1959, the night on which, based on the physical evidence at the camp and the timeline of the search, the deaths most likely occurred, multiple witnesses across a wide area of the northern Urals reported seeing unusual objects in the sky. They described them as luminous spheres, orange or white in color, moving silently at heights consistent with aircraft or higher. The reports came from multiple independent sources, members of another hiking group operating in the same general region that weekend, military personnel stationed at a radar installation in the Ural area, local residents in communities across a substantial geographic spread. The Soviet military acknowledged receiving the reports. The investigation noted them. Neither offered an explanation. The reports were filed and the matter was not pursued in the official record. They were classified along with everything else. The Dyatlov incident has generated more serious investigative attention than almost any other unexplained death event of the 20th century. This is partly a matter of circumstance, the age of the victims, the quality of the documentary evidence, the location in a strategically sensitive region during a period of acute geopolitical tension. But it is also a matter of the particular quality of the mystery itself. The case has a structure that resists resolution. Every serious explanation accounts for some of the evidence. None accounts for all of it. Every time you think you have found the thread that pulls the whole thing together, you find that it stops short of one or more of the facts. Let us go through the most serious explanations, and let us be genuinely honest about where each one does and does not work. The avalanche theory. The explanation formally adopted by the Russian prosecutor's office, which reopened the investigation in 2019 and closed it again in 2021 with an official conclusion, is that the group was struck by a small slab avalanche, a type of snow avalanche in which a cohesive layer of snow breaks away from the slope, while they were sleeping. The slab struck the tent with force, injuring some members of the group through the impact transmitted through the tent fabric, and causing all of them to cut their way out in a state of extreme alarm. Unable or unwilling to return uphill to the tent in the darkness and cold, possibly unable to return because the slope above was now unstable, possibly unwilling because the tent had been partially destroyed, they moved toward the tree line. Without proper clothing, they died of hypothermia. The internal injuries of the ravine victims are explained by the force of the snow slab impact on the tent, transmitted through the fabric and the sleeping bags to the bodies inside. The avalanche theory has the advantage of physical plausibility in its key mechanism. Snow slabs are documented to produce exactly the kind of internal injuries, bilateral rib fractures, compressive skull fractures, without significant external wounds that the Dyatlov ravine victims presented. The physics is correct, a compressive force applied over a broad area can fracture ribs and skulls without breaking the overlying skin, and this is precisely what certain configurations of snow slab impact can produce. The 2019 investigation used computer modeling to demonstrate that a small slab avalanche was geometrically possible on the slope where the tent was pitched under certain snow conditions. But the physical evidence at the scene, as documented by the searchers who arrived on February 26, did not support an avalanche. The snow around the tent was undisturbed except for the footprints of the 9 departing members. There was no debris field, no displaced snow, no broken crust, no evidence of the kind of surface disruption that even a small slab avalanche leaves behind. The tent was not crushed or partially buried, it was standing, its poles intact, cut from the inside. The group skis, stored beneath the tent floor as insulation against the cold ground, were not displaced or damaged. If a snow slab had struck the tent with sufficient force to produce bilateral rib fractures and fatal skull fractures in people sleeping inside it, the physical evidence at the scene would have looked different in every one of these respects. The tent would not have been standing with its poles intact. The snow surface around the tent would not have been undisturbed. The skis beneath the tent floor would not have been in their original positions. Additionally, and this is the point that experienced mountaineers consistently find most difficult to accept about the avalanche theory, the slope where the group had chosen to camp was not an obvious avalanche risk. Igor Dyatlov had selected the campsite. He was the best route finder and the most technically careful member of the group, a man who had been assessing mountain terrain for years, a man who understood snow behavior. His choice of campsite on a given night reflected a considered assessment of the conditions. If the slope had presented an obvious avalanche risk, he would not have camped there. This does not make the avalanche theory impossible. It makes it require additional assumptions, that a low probability event occurred, that it left less physical evidence than expected, that the most experienced person in the group misjudged the risk. Each of these is individually possible. Together they constitute a theory that requires a great deal of the evidence to be explained away, and that still does not account for the luminous spheres, the radioactive contamination, or the specific pattern of soft tissue loss in the ravine victims. The infrasound theory. A number of researchers, most notably the engineer Donny Eichar in his 2013 book about the incident, have proposed that the group was affected by infrasound, sound frequencies below the range of human hearing, typically defined as below 20 Hz, produced in certain cases by wind moving over specific terrain configurations. Infrasound at specific frequencies and intensities is documented to produce significant physiological and psychological effects in human beings: heightened anxiety, a powerful and often irrational feeling of dread, disorientation, in some cases visual disturbances and auditory illusions, and, at high intensities, a physical resonance effect in the chest cavity and the eye socket that produces extreme discomfort. Military researchers have investigated infrasound as a potential non-lethal weapon precisely because of these effects. The Kármán vortex effect, a phenomenon in which wind moving around certain obstacle shapes produces regular pressure oscillations in the downstream air, can generate infrasound in terrain with the right configuration. The northern Urals include terrain shapes that could, under the right wind conditions, produce this effect. The particular topography around Kholat-Syakhl, the shape of the slope, the relationship between the peak and the surrounding valleys, is consistent with infrasound generation in certain wind conditions. The condition of the tent and the pattern of departure, fast, disorganized, abandoning warm clothing, is consistent with the kind of panic response that severe infrasound exposure has been documented to produce. The problem is the ravine victims. Infrasound, while genuinely capable of producing extreme psychological effects and significant physical discomfort, does not produce physical trauma. It does not fracture skulls. It does not break ribs bilaterally. Whatever compressed the ribs of Ludmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov and fractured the skull of Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, it was not a sound wave. The infrasound theory may explain why the group left the tent in such a hurry. It does not explain what killed 4 of them in the ways they were killed. The military weapons test theory. In the context of the Soviet Union in February 1959, this is not a fringe theory and it should not be treated as one. It is a hypothesis based on documented facts about the region, the era, and the people involved, facts that establish the plausibility of the hypothesis even if they do not confirm it. The Northern Urals in 1959 were a significant military and industrial zone. The closed city of Chelyabinsk 40, containing the Mayak nuclear facility where Yuri Krivonischenko worked, was just a few hundred kilometers to the south. Just 2 years before the Dyatlov expedition, in September 1957, Mayak had experienced a catastrophic explosion, the KYSHTYM disaster, caused by a failure in the cooling system of a radioactive waste storage tank, which produced a massive release of radioactive contamination across the southern Urals affecting hundreds of square kilometers. The Soviet state suppressed all information about the KYSHTYM disaster completely and absolutely. It was not acknowledged until 1989. The capacity of the Soviet state to conceal large-scale events affecting its own territory and population was not theoretical, it was demonstrated. The same Soviet military-industrial complex that produced Mayak also operated weapons testing ranges, research installations, and classified facilities throughout the Ural region. The development of new weapons systems was proceeding at extraordinary pace in the late 1950s, driven by the Cold War arms race and by the institutional culture of Soviet military research, which rewarded ambitious technical development and did not impose the kinds of safety protocols and public accountability that Western military programs, imperfectly, maintained. Tests of new weapons required remote locations where they would not be observed by Western intelligence and where the consequences of an accident would not be immediately visible to the public. The military weapons theory holds that the Dyatlov group encountered the consequences of such a test, that they were either caught in the test of a new weapon, possibly a pressure weapon or a directed energy device of the type being developed in that period, or that they witnessed something they should not have seen and that their deaths were either an accidental consequence of the test or were deliberately ensured to prevent disclosure. In support of this theory, specifically and concretely, the radioactive contamination of the group's clothing, at levels above background but below immediately lethal thresholds, consistent with proximity to a radioactive event rather than direct exposure. The internal injuries of the ravine victims, consistent with pressure trauma rather than conventional physical impact. The luminous spheres seen by multiple independent witnesses, including military personnel, in the sky over the northern Urals on the relevant night, spheres that the military acknowledged receiving reports of and never explained. The classification of the investigation files, which goes beyond what the official explanation requires. The subsequent statement by Lev Ivanov that he had been pressured to close the case and not to pursue certain lines of inquiry. And Semyon Zolotaryov. Semyon Zolotaryov was 38 years old, a World War II veteran, a man with an unusual employment history, physical education instructor at various institutions across the Soviet Union, expedition leader in his own right, a series of positions that don't quite cohere into a straightforward professional biography. He joined the Dyatlov group at relatively short notice, replacing a member who had to withdraw due to illness. He had no prior connection to the Polytechnic Institute hiking club and no prior acquaintance with the other members of the group. His reason for wanting to join this specific expedition at this specific time has never been clearly established. The Soviet security services, the KGB and its predecessors and successor organizations, routinely placed informants within collective groups, workplaces, universities, sports clubs, hiking clubs. This was standard operating procedure, not exceptional surveillance. The role of such informants varied, some monitored for ideological deviation, some reported on specific individuals of interest, some were tasked with more specific objectives. A man with Zolotaryov's background, war veteran, physically capable, experienced in the mountains, old enough to have established credentials, would have been a plausible candidate for such a role. If Zolotaryov was placed in the group for a specific purpose, what might that purpose have been? If there was a weapons test planned for the area in which the group would be traveling, a planted member who could report back on what the group observed, and who could ensure that any sensitive information did not travel back with the survivors, would have operational utility. This is a hypothesis, and it should be stated as such. There is no documentary evidence that Zolotaryov was an informant. There is circumstantial evidence that his presence in the group was not entirely coincidental. The problem with the military weapons theory is not that it lacks supporting evidence. It has more supporting evidence than the avalanche theory. The problem is that it cannot be definitively confirmed without access to military and security service records that have not been released and, given the current political environment in Russia, may never be. The Russian state has not provided a full accounting of what military activities were occurring in the northern Urals on the night of February 1 to February 2, 1959. It has not released the relevant KGB files. It has not explained the radioactive contamination or the luminous spheres or the pressure on Lev Ivanov to close the case. Until that accounting is provided, if it ever is, the military theory remains the hypothesis that fits the most evidence and the hypothesis that cannot be confirmed. The Dyatlov Pass is named for a man who died there at 23. Before February 1959, it had no particular name, or rather, it had the name that the Montsi had always called it, as part of a landscape they had known for centuries. Now it carries the name of a young engineer from Sverdlovsk who was good at planning routes and whose meticulous preparations were, in the end, not enough. This is how places get their names, sometimes. Not through grandeur or significance or historical importance in the conventional sense, but through the weight of something that happened there, through the need of the living to mark the places where the dead were lost. The pass exists in the geological record as it always has, shaped by forces that predate human memory by millions of years. And now it also exists in human memory as the place where 9 people went and did not come back, and the name they gave it carries both of these realities simultaneously. The investigation that was reopened in Russia in 2019 and closed again in 2021 produced a formal conclusion, the avalanche conclusion, that most serious researchers and most of the families of the dead consider incomplete. It closed the formal case in the sense that there is now an official finding, but it did not close the questions that the evidence raises, and it did not satisfy the people who have been living with those questions for 65 years. The avalanche theory accounts for some of the evidence. It does not account for the radioactive contamination, the luminous spheres, the pressure on the original investigator to close the case quickly, the pattern of soft tissue loss in the ravine victims, or the presence and background of Semyon Zolotaryov. What do we actually know, after 65 years of investigation, documentation, analysis, and debate? We know that 9 experienced, trained, careful mountaineers died on Kholat Syakhl in the first days of February 1959. We know that whatever caused their deaths was sudden enough and severe enough to drive all 9 of them from their tent without their boots in -15-degree cold. We know that 4 of them died with internal injuries consistent with extreme compressive force applied without leaving external wounds. We know that the clothing of at least some of the group was radioactively contaminated at levels above background. We know that multiple independent witnesses reported luminous spheres in the sky over the relevant area on the relevant night. We know that the original investigating officer was pressured to close the case quickly and to attribute the deaths to a natural cause. We know that the files were classified for 30 years. These are facts. They are documented facts, established by multiple independent sources. And they do not assemble into a single coherent narrative that all of them fit. The avalanche theory fits some. The infrasound theory fits some. The military weapons theory fits more than either of the others but still requires assumptions that cannot currently be verified. The combination of all 3 fits more still, but begins to feel like construction rather than discovery. The most honest position, 65 years on, is this: we do not know what happened. We have good guesses. We have one guess that fits more of the evidence than the others. We have a formal official conclusion that most serious observers consider inadequate. And we have the persistent suspicion, shared by the original investigator, shared by many researchers over the decades, shared by most of the families, that something is known somewhere that has not been said. That the full account of what happened on Kholat Syakhl in February 1959 is in a file somewhere, and that file has not been opened. Lev Ivanov gave a long interview in 1990, in the opening period of the Soviet archive releases, in which he spoke with a frankness that his official reports had not permitted. He was old by then, and the system that had silenced him was dissolving, and he said things that he had been unable to say for 30 years. He said that he had been told to attribute the deaths to a natural cause and to close the case. He said he had not believed, then or since, that the deaths were caused by a natural cause he understood. He said he had seen things at the scene that he could not account for with any framework available to him, and that the pressure to close the case had prevented him from investigating those things properly. He mentioned the luminous spheres. He mentioned the radioactive contamination. He mentioned the injuries of the ravine victims. He said that in the 30 years since the investigation, he had thought about the case many times, and that his conclusion, held privately for decades, stated publicly for the first time in that interview, was that the group had encountered something connected to military activity that the Soviet state had reasons not to acknowledge. He did not claim to know what the military activity was. He did not claim to know exactly what had happened to the group. He said only that he had been in the room, he had seen the evidence, and he had been told not to look closely at what was in that room. And that looking away had cost him something. That carrying the question for 30 years, unable to pursue it and unable to put it down, had been a weight he had not expected. There is something that deserves to be said about the nature of the 65 years of attention that the Dyatlov incident has received, and what that attention has cost and produced. The case has attracted, inevitably, a great deal of speculation that goes well beyond the evidence. Theories involving extraterrestrials, yetis, time travel, secret government experiments of an implausible scale. These theories exist at the outer edge of the conversation about Dyatlov, and they are not taken seriously by serious investigators, and they do not deserve extended treatment here. But they are worth acknowledging, because they tell us something about what the genuine mystery produces in people, about the particular kind of discomfort that a well-documented, persistently unexplained event generates in the human mind. We are not good at sitting with genuine uncertainty. We prefer insufficient answers to acknowledged ignorance. The more dramatic the event and the more thoroughly documented the evidence, the stronger the pressure to find an explanation, any explanation, that closes the gap between what we know and what we can accept. The Dyatlov incident is dramatic. It is extensively documented. It has been investigated by people with real expertise using real methods. And it remains genuinely unexplained. The pressure this produces is, for some people, resolved by reaching for increasingly extraordinary hypotheses. This is a recognizably human response, and it is not entirely to be dismissed. The extraordinary hypotheses are sometimes, in the history of knowledge, the correct ones. But the serious researchers who have spent the most time with the Dyatlov evidence, the ones who have read every document, visited the past, spoken with the survivors and the searchers and the investigators, tend to converge, not on certainty, but on a more modest position. Something happened in the northern Urals in February 1959 that involved, at minimum, a level of physical force not associated with any natural weather event and a level of institutional secrecy not associated with an ordinary accident. Beyond that, the evidence supports inference but not conclusion. The case is not closed, and pretending otherwise disrespects both the nine and the truth. Yuri Yudin died in April 2013, at the age of 75. He had spent 54 years as the person who went in and came back, the person the questions gathered around, the person at whom the inexplicability pointed. He handled it with a grace that, in retrospect, seems remarkable. He did not become consumed by grief, did not become a professional victim of the mystery, did not retreat from ordinary life. He became a teacher of geography. He raised a family. He lived a full life in the way that the other nine did not get to. In one of his last public interviews, he said something that has stayed with everyone who heard it. He said that he did not want the nine to be remembered primarily as a mystery. He said that the mystery was, in a sense, what had happened to them after their deaths, the way they had been claimed by it, reduced to it, turned into an internet phenomenon and a documentary subject and a debate about evidence. He wanted them to be remembered as people. As specific, irreplaceable, individual people who had lived and worked and loved and laughed and had plans for the rest of their lives. Igor, who designed his own ski bindings and thought about expeditions like engineering problems and was 23 years old and was going to live for decades. Zina, who made the cold days feel shorter, whose diary entries from those last days read like the diary of someone with a great deal of future ahead of her. Liuda, who sharpened in difficulty when others wore down, who was 20 years old and had already earned the respect of mountaineers twice her age. Rustam, who kept the technical notes, who would have made an excellent engineer if he had lived to become one. Yuri Krivonyshenko, with his mandolin. Yuri Doroshenko, who appears in the photographs with Zina, close enough that you can see the ease between them. Kolyar, the watchful one, carrying the weight of his father's history into a future that was supposed to be different from the past. Semyon, the veteran, the oldest, the one who does not quite fit, who had survived Stalingrad and was not supposed to die in the mountains. And Sasha Kolevatov. Alexander Kolevatov, 24 years old, a physics student, a quiet person whom his companions described as steady and reliable and thoughtful. He died in the ravine in the northern Urals in February 1959 and was not found until the snow melted in May, and he has been mentioned less often in this telling than the others, and he deserves to have his name said clearly. There is a simple memorial on the pass now, a marker with their 9 names and the years they were born and the year they died. People make the journey to see it. The pass is still remote, still accessible only on foot in winter, still the kind of place where the wind comes from the north and the cold is unambiguous and the landscape offers nothing in the way of comfort or shelter above the tree line. Whatever happened there on the 1st or 2nd day of February 1959, whatever the truth is, however it would read if the full file were opened and the complete account were known, the place itself does not carry it visibly. The mountains do not show what they have seen. The snow falls in the same patterns as it always has. The Monsi still know the name. Tonight, as you settle toward sleep, consider what it means to hold a question for 50 years. To carry it not as an obsession but as a steady presence, the way you carry a loss that does not resolve, not dragging you under, but always there, part of the weight of being the person you are. Yuri Yudin carried that question for 54 years and kept his life intact and his spirit whole. He became a teacher. He raised a family. He did not close the question and he did not put it down. He kept asking, honestly and without demanding an answer that the evidence could not provide, and he made his peace with the not knowing in a way that seems, from the outside, to have required something rare and quiet and admirable. The pass is still there. The question is still open. And somewhere in the archives of the Russian state, in a folder that has been in the same filing cabinet since 1959 or transferred to newer storage since then but still classified, the full account may exist. The full account of what happened on Kholat Syakhl, on the night when the luminous spheres were seen and 9 experienced mountaineers cut their way out of their tent and walked into the cold and did not come back. We may never read it. But the question remains. Patient, persistent, exact. Sleep well.